Welcome back to another episode of Heavy Wireless, a podcast that's part of the Packet Pushers Podcast Network. And today we're talking about cellular, LTE, private, oh, come on, JR, help me. What are these terms here? Today I have Jeremy Rollinson with me, and we're going to talk about private cellular.
So thanks for having me along, Keith. Yeah, you've immediately hit on one of the difficult things about bringing a new technology to market. What terminology do we use? And I think it's something that the industry has struggled with. It's natural that you get some of the early vendors trying to own some of these things and brand them. I personally believe that the market tells us these kind of things, and it's more of a listening rather than a telling exercise. And in my experience, I think from listening to everyone out there and my friends in the Wi-Fi world, that's where I was before I entered the cellular world. Let's just keep the terminology relatively similar. The overall architecture isn't so different. There are some very specific changes in the protocols and all these kind of things, but basically the architecture is the same. You have the radio side where you're distributing RF signal. In the Wi-Fi world, that's an access point. In the cellular world, that could be LTE or 5G. It could be an E node B or a G node B, to use the 3GPP terminology, but it's performing the same function as a Wi-Fi access point. So let's just call it a cellular access point, shall we? It's easy enough for everyone to understand exactly what that box does. How you feel about that?
Well, we know what APs are, so just calling it a cellular AP kind of it's not a Wi-Fi AP, but it's performing that task. Well, what about the private public 5G LTE 3GPP confusion?
This one is one that's still got to be sorted out. There are times that I have conversations with customers and they're telling me, it's great that you have everything in a box. Now we don't need to have any of our public cellular backhaul when we're on site. And I'm like, well, wait, hang on a second. I'm not rebuilding a public cellular network. You still need something to get back to the internet. Oh, we thought you were building a whole new... No, not that. So there's still a little bit of confusion out there, and that's understandable. When we talk about public networks, that's AT&T's, Verizon's, and everyone of this world. And private, you don't call Wi-Fi private Wi-Fi and then carrier Wi-Fi. What terminology is common there? I mean, there's a lot of discussion around Passpoint, people deploying, turning that on their Wi-Fi networks right now. How are people talking about that public Wi-Fi service versus their private Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi is just assumed to be private from the get-go, right? Mm-hmm. So private cellular, private mobile. I think private mobile makes more sense. People talk about mobile networks, not cellular networks. Cellular is technology. Mobile is how it's used. So I think private mobile networks is probably the most sensible way to go, but it's still not 100% clear in the market. And part of that is just not enough people are using it yet. So that common language has yet to be established. We don't have the social proof that creates that language just yet. So I think my prediction is private mobile networks, but I could be wrong.
So we have public, and that's the carriers we know and love, and their business model is to charge you for all the traffic that goes across, either voice or data. And then the private is the opposite of public in this case. You're going to own your own. But then that's more of a qualifier. This is the private version. We had a history of running data over cellular for a long time, 1X RTT originally. I mean, there's some really old stuff. And do you know if anyone's ever ran like a private 1X RTT? Or did the private start with LTE?
I think private started being talked about with LTE, and there are more examples of that going back. You've got these large installations in places like ports and these other multimodal facilities. But these were tended to be in service to a very specific private requirement where they also wanted that public network coverage to be extended into their area at the same time, and it tended to be something that the public carriers would deploy as a managed service for that customer. It wasn't something that that customer was consuming, adding to their network. It was something they were taking purely as a managed service. I think the difference today is that now customers can, in the enterprise space, can consume private cellular in the same way that they consume Wi-Fi.
As in, they own the equipment, the infrastructure. Exactly. And then we get to this, so private LTE, we could have called it private 4G instead. I get people who are like, I want private 5G, but I want it to run LTE. Well, then just call it private LTE.
I've had the battle over the years of when you're working on event sites, you're not just designing and deploying the network and then saying cheerio. You have to run the thing as well and do all the customer support. So people are often on the radio saying, oh, the Wi-Fi is down. Oh, but are all the bars on your laptop, are they all like normal? Oh, yeah, they're fine. Oh, okay. Wi-Fi isn't down at all. But as far as they're concerned, Wi-Fi is the internet is Wi-Fi. Fight that as long as you want until you're blue in the face, losing battle. I think it's, similar in our world. There's going to be, a path that things take and why fight it?
Well, there is also the confusion that I think the Wi-Fi Alliance was a little presumptive. They heard the 5G out in the cellular world, and so they wanted to preempt it with Wi-Fi 6, which wasn't 6 gigahertz, but it wouldn't have been nice if it was. And then we added 6E, and then we have 7. It's even better, but it's really running on 6 gigahertz, but it also supports 2.4. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion out there in many of the terms we're using. So private cellular, private mobile, as you called it, can be in different flavors of the technology, either LTE, 4G, or 5G. In your view, is there any reason at this point to support one over the other from a cost or a technology standpoint?
So there are certain, I would say, application standpoints. I tend to think about all of private mobile in terms of the applications that are really important in terms of driving adoption. People do like deploying new technology in their networks, but it's usually in service of some other application that's driving that requirement. So I think for any situation, what I would say to my friends and for any situation where you've got a large coverage area with a low density of devices, and those devices are doing a low bitrate type application like barcode scanning, RFID, that kind of thing, that sort of, you want predictable latency, but there's not a huge amount of traffic, but you need to cover a big area. Perfect for the LTE or 4G version of private mobile networks. And then if you've got something that must have ultra low latency or as low as possible, and you do want to send video and other high bitrate applications, then that's when you're starting to look at the 5G version. That's sort of my line at the moment. High bitrate on 5G, low bitrate applications. LTE is absolutely perfect for that. You don't need to go to the additional expense of deploying 5G because we're still in the early days of the availability of the 5G radios. So, they're still quite an expensive commodity.
Well, I like that. That's a good explanation of what are you going to use it for, and then we'll apply the correct technology. Amazing how a lot of people miss that. Another component of this whole thing is frequency. In the Wi-Fi world, we've been sharing 2.4 with Bluetooth and others. We basically kind of own most of 5G, although it's not legally ours, it just happened to be that we're the most user there. In 6 gig, is depending on which country, we're probably the primary user, but not the most important because there was people there before us, and so we have AFC to kind of make sure that they're protected. In the private cellular mobile space, what are the RF frequencies we use?
So in the US, we have the CBRS scheme. It's a program rather than a technology. It describes how private mobile networks function in the US. So that uses 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz, 150 megahertz of spectrum, which is actually quite a lot. Most people don't know that up until a few years ago, Verizon didn't own that much spectrum across the whole of America, and they ran an entire mobile network on that. So there's quite a lot of spectrum for cellular, and it is assigned dynamically. There are preferred users, people who have licenses in specific areas, and then general access, which is pretty much everyone else and what most people consume that as in the US today. Outside of the US, a lot of people are in a similar kind of spectrum, so from the mid 3 gig up to sort of 4.2. In the US, T-Mobile have some of that band, N77, but in a lot of Europe and other countries around the world, that N77, N78 band is what's being used for private mobile networks.
And is that lightly licensed, or it's not unlicensed? But what's kind of a process if I was an enterprise in Germany and I wanted to apply one of these private mobile networks?
In most of Europe currently, you apply based on your geographic location, and the whatever ruling body will give you a license for a period of time to use that frequency at that location.
Is it terribly expensive?
It's a little. No, typically no, not expensive. I think they're just trying to cover the admin fee and make sure that it's being consumed responsibly around the country. The US is very different in that everything is organized more in the AFC sense that you have in outdoor 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, in that automatic frequency coordination is how CBRS is managed. So every radio is licensed rather than the location or the user. So the radio has the FCC license. It requests spectrum from spectrum allocation servers, at which point it has to supply its certificate. And then at that point, it will be granted spectrum in its specific geographic location, as long as it maintains a 24-hour sort of check-in to keep it.
So that fits the U.S.'s CBRS. Do you know what's going on up in Canada?
I believe in Canada, again, it's going to be by application, because there's a big push up there for use of the spectrum by, obviously, Canada has an awful lot of space outside the cities and very low density population in a lot of those areas. And they have they've had long-term connectivity challenges. So they want to be able to empower those communities to connect themselves. So I think it is primarily done on a sort of location-based basis, and you put in an application for a license. Currently, a lot of people are looking at how CBRS is being managed. A lot of countries are obviously having to join the AFC type management of wireless spectrum. So I think over time we'll start to see more of that automatic frequency coordination, even in private mobile across the world, but it'll take time.
Well, in a general sense, in your experience over the last couple of years that you've been in this private mobile space, have you ever had difficulty getting spectrum available?
In the very early days, but that was partly because of where I was working from my home lab in Santa Cruz, which is right smack in an area where the US Navy liked to troll around, and Google SAS that we were using at the time wasn't especially friendly to that. So there I had an issue. That was one of the few times I've ever had a problem. But even with the Navy being the priority user, we've had active radios both in New York and in San Francisco during Fleet Week. I've seen them run, no problem whatsoever. So those protections can kick in, but exceptionally rare in my experience, and becoming even rarer as the systems mature.
That's actually a very positive sign that this is becoming, it's actually ready for prime time now.
Oh, for sure. I think really now it's just that association with the applications. There's been a lot of education about the technology, but now what we need is folks out there using it for interesting applications, enabling new services in their enterprises. I'm really interested to see when broad adoption happens, how much relief we give to the Wi-Fi side of the spectrum, because Wi-Fi has had to carry all of this load for so long. And I think there's actually a case to be made to say, okay, well, if we unload the network from some of the things it's not so great at, then maybe we might get another year, 2 years out of what we already have. There's, I don't think there's enough talked about in that respect, because Wi-Fi's been asked to do an awful lot for a long time.
Especially in where places and applications that it's not really good at. I think part of the problem is Wi-Fi has been so cheap. I mean, the chips are cheap. The frequency is unlicensed. You can buy hardware really inexpensively, and the clients are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So let's just make Wi-Fi do these things that maybe it probably wasn't best at. You gave an example last week. You were in the Javits Center, which I've been multiple times. What was the frequency? What was the spectrum looking like for Wi-Fi?
Actually, because I took my Wi-Fi, as I take it everywhere, because I'm terrible for not leaving work behind. And I checked, because I'm like, this can't be right. I was sat right underneath, or adjacent to some Cisco, relatively new Cisco APs with stadium antennas in the ceiling pointing down. Like, okay, done the best you can. So I sit adjacent to it somewhere where I think is going to be reasonable. Fire up the Wi-Fi. The air looks fine, actually. It really doesn't look that bad. So I think there's other things happening there that might need some attention. But honestly, the congestion, especially in 5 gigahertz, didn't look that bad. One of the things that I would say about that show in particular is that there's an awful lot of HDMI wireless transmitters blasting across the whole of 5 gigahertz.
And they're nasty.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I had earlier mentioned we mostly own 5 gig in the Wi-Fi space, except for that one. Yeah, HDMI, they're when you see them on your spec can, you're like, no, but they do work pretty good. Right. At times when you need that HDMI remotely, it's a solution, expensive solution, but it does work.
I mean, in the video world, it's the event video world we're working in right now. It's actually an inexpensive solution. Like, the expensive solution is what they have in these big stadiums. I think it's called VisLink. It's like licensed spectrum, but the unlicensed stuff is the low cost solution. A lot of the things where you see, okay, well, we're getting video from a DJI drone. That's 5 gigahertz, just slap bang right in there. If it's not using Wi-Fi, they've got a 5 gigahertz transmitter as well. So, it's out there and it's being used, which is why we're moving some of the video to cellular too.
Well, that's a nice segue to what's the current status? You've been around in this space since, 4 or 5 years now? I mean, I just got my CPI renewal, and so that means I started in CBRS 5 years ago. Yeah. What's kind of the status? Where are we sitting today?
So I think we're at a very interesting point. I'm at a very interesting point. We've just launched a new company, Waveriders Collective. It's something that I personally been working on for pretty much 6 years, and was the reason that I ended up working at Salona, which was honestly where I got my 10,000 hours. That was hardcore cellular university, and I learned from the best. I was very fortunate. But the goal has always been to build a private mobile network that can be easily deployed at events, easily consumable, easily manageable, because the networks I designed for events, still my design in a lot of places, they just got so complicated and so complex. Necessarily, there's no way around it. It's just, we did the best we could with what we had, but we were pushing the absolute limits, and there's been no innovation since 2012. So Waveriders Collective is bringing private mobile networks to events. Our first system is the one you see behind me, which we debuted at NAB last week. It's a portable private 5G network in a Pelican carry-on size case. So walk into any location, turn it on, provide it with some internet connectivity, and you'll have a 5G network within 5 minutes. At NAB, the use case was for connecting video cameras. It's a big deal. That was something that was gained a lot of technical attention at the Olympics. There was a lot of video contribution of the private 5G there. So with our partners High Vision, we're looking at a very interesting few months as people start to try out broadcast video over private 5G for the first time.
And that's using CBRS for its frequency, 5G for the technology, private because it's your gear, cellular because 5G is part of the cellular group, and you give it Ethernet to get connection. Then let's add a whole nother layer on top of this. I'll just call it authentication. Is it SIM based? And if so, they're your SIMs, or are you supporting eSIMs?
So we support our own SIMs, and it's helpful actually because when we send out the kit, we can send a limited amount of physical SIMs with it, so we control how many devices connect to it. So when we say 10 cameras, it's 10 cameras. And also, we do support eSIM because in video world, there's an awful lot of applications that are used to manage video workflow and to get things like return video feeds so the camera person can see what's being sent out and even see their own shot, all of which has to be done very low latency, obviously. But yeah, so we support eSIM currently for iOS devices and Android devices on a case-by-case basis. We have as soon as we've tested them, they get a tick, but there's so many, and there are so many different factors that we have to test them first. But otherwise, yeah, we support eSIM also. But it's a full package all in one go.
Okay, now I'm going to throw one more. This is the last technical question for you.
Sure.
Neutral host. How does neutral host, that as in I have an AT&T SIM and I want to use your private system? And I'm speaking about for a voice call.
Okay. So this is something that has been talked about in the industry for quite a long time and is seen as sort of the grease that's going to unlock a lot of these opportunities, which I think is a shame because this will be solved. It is not a technical issue that is holding back ubiquitous availability of neutral host on private mobile networks. It is a certification, validation, testing process, which honestly goes as fast as the AT&Ts and the T-Mobiles and the Verizons of this world will go, which as we know is not fast, and that's fine. They have to run public mobile networks that as much as possible have to work in very nasty natural disasters. Like, it's serious what they do. So they're very serious about extending coverage of their networks onto private. Understandable, but still also frustratingly slow. Which means from the customer point of view, right now, your options to be able to do this are restricted to the private mobile vendors who have relationships and who've done the certification with those particular carriers. And I think most of the private vendors out there right now, I know for sure Solona, Highway 9, GXC, and others have certified with certain carriers, not all of them, but there is some availability of neutral host, but it's not ubiquitous yet.
Not a wonderful answer, because you're spot on. It's moving at the speed of carriers. So I just had to bring up that because it says private mobile that supports the technology of LTE or 5G does not mean that you're going to get your cell call on like you thought you were.
But look, there are people trying to approach this in all kinds of different ways. There are multiple ways to address this, whether it be a technology like MOCN, or whether it be simple PLM NID roaming, which is how roaming works in the cellular world today, or something like EPDG, which Wi-Fi calling, if you have it enabled on your phone and you happen to be on a Passpoint network, your call's going over Wi-Fi. We already do that. There's no reason technically why that can't happen somewhere else. on another network, another wireless network. It just isn't functionally turned on yet. So, I think there's going to be a lot of development in the next 12 to 18 months. You've got people like Trevor at Network FX who's really pushing and trying to be creative about how this happens. And, there are others alongside trying to explore ways to do this. So I think we're going to see some innovation here. And within 2 to 3 years, it'll be a much clearer picture. But for right now, do not let the availability of neutral host influence your decision about whether deploying a private mobile network is a good idea, because don't wait for that.
There are applications and locations where private mobile is the best answer. So,
yeah. And look, if there's absolutely no macro network at all, i.e. zero signal, and you have Wi-Fi calling enabled on your iPhone, it will use whatever data network it has. It doesn't know what it's connected to. It just sees data, and your Wi-Fi calling will work, but there has to be no network at all.
Like none. Well, Jeremy, thank you for your time today. If someone wanted to track you down, how would they find you and meet you? And
I'm annoyingly online at LinkedIn. So you can find me there very easily. Jeremy Rollinson is a pretty easy name to find. And, attach private 5G to that, and I'm even easier to find. And then keep an eye out. Probably by the time this is published, our website will be live at waveriders.live.
Live, like LIVE. All right, we'll add those to the show notes. Thank you for your time. You've been listening to another episode of Heavy Wireless, part of the Packet Pushers Podcast Network. If you have other ideas or thoughts about wireless networking, feel free to leave comments in the show notes, and we look forward to talking to you in the next episode. Thank you.